All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Toby Spiro. I'm the Education Director here at AWFS. It's my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Chris Kuehl for his regular economic update for us and for the woodworking industry. I'm sure many of you know Dr. Kuehl is Armada's chief economist. He's got over 21 years of experience working with private clients and professional associations. And he also serves as the chief economist for several national business groups. And he's the economic analyst for Fabricators and Manufacturers Association, and he writes a biweekly publication, Fabrinomics. Also, you might have seen through us that he co-edits the Armada flagship brief, which we send out to our members. And he's a sought-after keynote speaker. He's spoken for us before, nationally and internationally. He's got a doctorate in political economics, advanced degrees in Soviet and Asian studies. Unfortunately, more important than ever, I'm sure, right, Chris? Um, and he's taught economics and finance for over 15 years. Without further ado, please welcome Chris.
Very good. Well, I will share my screen so you don't have to stare at me for an hour, because that would be no fun. Here we go. Ta-da. All right. So, with any luck, this will actually go to a full screen. Ta-da. So, I apologize if there are extraneous noises periodically. I am set up in a hotel corridor in between a bunch of meeting rooms, and this hotel has a tragic lack of chairs and tables. So I'm kind of perched in the best I could find. So if people come by talking about something that has nothing to do with economics or nothing to do with woodworking, it's just because they're having a meeting here and I'm probably right outside their door. So we'll proceed and see how far we get. Before we get too far into this, I have to remind you that economics is a strange and often wonderful area of expertise, as John Kenneth Galbraith would point out, is extremely useful as a form of employment for economists. He has some really good other quotes. One of my favorite is that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. He also talks about the fact that if you put five economists in a room, you're going to get five different opinions, six if one's from Harvard. So we're going to take that under advisement because a lot of what we've been hearing in the last few weeks has been confusing. If you listen to one set of economists, they are shocked and astonished at what the Fed did with interest rates. You talk to another group of economists and they're like, yeah, that's what I expected, no big deal. You talk to yet a third group and they're like, I don't know if it matters at all what the Fed does. So we'll talk a little bit about what we think motivated this latest decision, what may happen as far as the rest of the year is concerned, and really focus more on what happens next year because for the majority of the analysts, this was step one. This was something that was expected. I mean, obviously, we've been predicting some kind of movement from the Fed for months now. Most had thought that it was going to be a quarter point, but in the last month or so, you started hearing people talking about why the Fed might want to move a little more aggressively. So we'll talk about why that might have been the case. So here we go. I don't mean to be a media basher, but I end up becoming a media basher because there was an awful lot of almost hysterical coverage, like this was out of the blue, that no one had thought this could be a possibility, which in fact many people were expecting. I mean, the markets, for all intents and purposes, built this in. I mean, there was no real reaction on the part of the markets. They just kind of took it in stride and said, yeah, we knew it was coming. We figured it would be quarter point, half point. If it had been a full point or something, there would have been a much more excitable response, but it wasn't anything close to that. So the investment impact was pretty limited. The market responded for a few days, kind of settled back down to norm. What was cracking me up about the media coverage was this discussion about how this is going to change the consumer's life overnight. That there was suddenly going to be reduced interest rates on credit cards. There was going to be reduced mortgage rates. There were going to be reduced car loan rates. There was going to be all kinds of stuff. Well, that's unrealistic. The consumer reaction to this is much more subdued because it isn't that big a change in the great scheme of things. Moving from 5.5 to 5, those are still pretty high rates. Plus the fact it takes a while for this stuff to trickle down through the system, particularly things like credit cards. Credit card rates aren't going to change until you probably see rates back down to 2.75 or 3 or even lower. Mortgage rates depend as much on the long-term investment mood of the bond market than it does on Fed funds rate, so that's not necessarily going to change either. So for the consumer, it's basically a start that you're going to start to see rate reductions, but nothing that's really going to show up in the pocketbook for months, if at all. I mean, it's going to depend on what those intermediate institutions want to do. Commercial borrowers will probably see a little bit more activity, and this certainly affects the industry you're in because this is construction. What has been going on for the last several months is that construction operations have not been ended, they have not been canceled, they've been stalled. There's been a determination by many of the developers that if financing is going to be less expensive, it's going to come down. It's going to come down either September or come down in October, whatever. So the discussion was, well, let's wait. Let's wait until we see what financing costs are going to be. And now that they have an idea that this is heading in the direction they would like it to, you'll start to see some of these projects open up. They never were canceled. They never were abandoned. They were basically delayed. So now that the reason for that delay has evaporated to a degree, many of these projects will start back up again because there's a little bit of a decision to be made here. If you wait longer, and there's some incentive to do that, if you wait for the rates to come down even further in December or sometime in the coming year, well, you run the risk then of having shortages of available labor. You're running the risk of shortages of commodities and intermediate goods because as other people start to launch their projects, they may be first in line to get the materials and the employees that they need. So companies are at that point of saying, well, if I wait, financing costs might come down further, but then I'm going to struggle to find the people I need and the materials that I need and the commodities that I need. If I act now, I'll be at the front of the list. I'll get what I need sooner than later. However, those that wait may end up getting better financing costs. So it kind of becomes a matter of which risk do you want to run? And we're seeing sort of the most lucrative orientations taking first steps. I mean, this is probably going to be more expansion on the medical side. Not a lot of activity yet on retail, not a lot of activity even on things like tourism and that kind of development, but it's continued activity in the warehousing, logistics sector, and medical. The biggest impact, and this may have been one of the things that motivated the Fed to make a more aggressive move, is the dollar. The dollar has been very strong, and that is not necessarily a good or bad thing. It kind of depends on what side of the fence you're on. When the dollar is as strong as it has been, it discriminates against exports. It's harder for us to sell things overseas. So when the dollar begins to weaken just a bit, it makes it easier for the U.S. to export what it exports. We are predominantly an exporter of two things, food and high value manufacturing. So we're at both ends of that spectrum. We have inexpensive stuff, food, we have high value stuff. The high value stuff is what responds to dollar value. So when you look at the U.S. export sector, it is airplanes and it's road building equipment and it's just heavy duty stuff, robotics, technology. Those are high value, high dollar, and a little bit of a change in the value proposition between the dollar and whatever currency that country uses benefits. On the other hand, as the dollar becomes a little weaker, it makes imports more expensive. So there's always a balance. We don't import as much of the high value stuff as we export. Exports are making up about 15% of the U.S. GDP. So it's significant, but it's not dominant. It's not like Germany, for example, which relies on exports for 55% of its GDP. So what now? What happens? Do we cut again in December? Probably. Probably a quarter point. I don't think the Fed feels the urgency to do something dramatic right on top of this dramatic move. A couple of things we'll talk about in more detail are just the motivations for a central bank. We're going to find out more about their reasoning when the Fed minutes come out, and that ought to be any day now, probably first of next week. There were some dissenters already. If you look at the vote as far as making this half point cut, you had Mickey Bowman from the Board of Governors take the position that this was too aggressive, that it should have been a quarter point, if at all. And there's going to be an opportunity to see what kind of logic was being applied when the minutes emerge. And I know you all read the minutes avidly, so this is your big chance to do that again. A couple of things to be aware of, just of kind of the behavior of the last few years and how it has changed expectations, how it's changed how the central banks look at things. There was a lot of talk, even 3 or 4 years ago, about the poly crisis, that we were going to have all of these things hitting us at the same time, and that it was going to make it very difficult to make any kind of reasonable determination as far as central bank policy or any other policy for that matter. We were expecting stagflation. We were supposed to see something similar to what we saw in the 1970s. Stagflation is when you have two usually diametrically opposed problems at the same time. That you have very low growth, nearly recession, if not actual recession, combined with very high inflation, because usually those are mutually exclusive. If you have a recession, it tends to drive down prices because there's not as much demand, people are having trouble getting jobs, there's not as many of them on offer, therefore pay is less. All kinds of things tend to drive inflation down during a recession. When you have inflation, you also have growth, because a lot of what spurs inflation is growth. It's having too much demand for limited supply. That's why stagflation is so weird and why it's relatively rare. Well, we got the inflation part. We did not get the low levels of growth. So the growth numbers were quite respectable all last year. If you look back to 2023, we had circumstances where we thought we were going to see a decline in first quarter. We thought we'd see a decline in second or third or fourth. We didn't. We were over 2% every one of those quarters. In the third quarter, we were up as high as 5%. So we didn't get that feared stagflation that we thought we would see. So that changes a lot of the perspective as far as central banks are concerned. We thought we were going to see an oil crisis. We thought we were going to see a dramatic increase in the price of oil because of the Ukraine invasion. The Russians were going to get hit with sanctions. The sanctions were going to severely impact their oil business. We saw predictions for, 150, 160, even $200 a barrel oil. Now you get into those numbers and that slows the world economy down dramatically. We didn't get it. Russia now sells more oil around the world than it did before the sanctions. But there's now more of a worry about an oil glut than there is an oil shortage. Russia sells to China now. It sells to India now. It sells everywhere but Europe, really. And we've not seen an impact on oil prices anywhere close to what people thought they would see. I was checking the per barrel prices literally just a day or so ago, and it was like low 70s for WTI or Brent, so both the U.S. measurement and the international. So we're not experiencing an oil crisis. We may actually see a reverse crisis if the prices fall too low, because then you start to see pressure on U.S. producers that really can't produce profitably when prices get close to 60. Now, they're not there yet. They're still like $10 north of that, but you're seeing things like expanded Russian production. You're seeing Libya coming back into the fold. So lots of different things to concern with there, but not shortage and not excessively expensive oil. We thought we were going to see a food crisis. there was going to be a problem with getting food production out of Ukraine. Russia was going to block it, and Ukraine and Russia combined were responsible for something like 25% of the world's corn. Well, the Russian corn growers pointed out to the Russians that if you block Ukrainian flow, you're also blocking us. And so suddenly all of those restrictions did not pan out. And as a result, most of the crop discussion was moot. We also had good crop years in places like the US and Canada, so we never did get the crop food crisis that we thought we might. In other words, we did not get the global recession. Every Western world nation was above recession territory. Now, Europe has not been very far above it. I mean, it's Europeans get excited when they get 0.05 growth. We have definitely not been anywhere near recession, not with 2.5, 2.6, 2.8% growth. So in the end, did the central banks do what they should have done? I mean, I think so. I mean, they raised rates when inflation took off, and inflation took off kind of artificial reasons. I mean, we don't talk about the pandemic much now. I think we want to put that in the rearview mirror, but a lot of what drove inflation was the flood of money that came into the system and then having no place to go because time-honored tradition, when you're in a recession, you throw money at the consumer, you hope that the consumer goes on a spending spree and spends you right out of that recession. And normally that's what happens. But if there's no place to spend it, if everything is closed, if you can't go to the store, you can't go out to eat, you can't travel, you can't go on vacation, where do you spend the money? And at the very same time that you were seeing that flood of money come in, you had a supply chain crisis. We all remember that. You couldn't get product. You couldn't get what you needed, couldn't get commodities. So you had simultaneously way too much money and a severe shortage of pretty much everything people needed or wanted. That is a combination that guarantees inflation. So you have an artificial shortage and people have plenty of money. Well, those who had the most got what they wanted, and those who didn't. And that ended up skewing a lot of sectors and feeding into inflation. So I don't want to say all of this was media and political hysteria, but there was a lot of stuff that came out during that pandemic that, in retrospect, like that was really dumb and didn't accomplish what we hoped it would accomplish in the first place and definitely put many economies in a desperate position, which are still recovering from. So here's the projection going forward. This is GDP now. This is coming out of the Atlanta Fed, and the Atlanta Fed sort of does a running tally of what they expect in a given quarter. So it's changing almost every day. It has been consistently above 2. The most recent one I just looked at like yesterday had it almost to 3. So third quarter projection was coming very close to 3%. Now we're beginning to get into fourth quarter. Fourth quarter would be October, November, December. And so we're just on the edge of starting that issue. Fourth quarter is traditionally a very strong quarter because it's the consumer quarter. It's when the retail sector takes over and we have the holiday spending come up. At this stage, it's looking more positive than people thought it would. The retailers gambled quite a bit as we went into the summer, and we'll talk a little bit later about why. But the shipping season was early. The shipping season was starting at least a month or two sooner than it normally did because the retailers were worried about supply and they were afraid that events that are likely to transpire in the next week or so was going to make it harder for them to get what they needed. So they ended up ordering it way sooner than usual. Good strategy as far as defeating some of these potential threats. But the problem is that if you don't predict correctly what the demand is, you're either going to be short at a point when the consumer is willing to spend, or you're going to have a surplus that you're going to have to get rid of come next year. At this point, it looks more likely that they'll come up short. Halloween is the traditional beginning of the holiday season, and it's so far proving robust. The average American spends between $400 and $500 a year or a Halloween. And if you're not one of those, you certainly have a neighbor who has been putting up the decorations already. So it's a big deal now. This is the fifth year in a row that adult costumes will have outsold children's. It's now an adult holiday. It's now a decorating holiday, and it's the second largest spending holiday in the calendar. That's followed by Black November. Used to be Black Friday. Now it's the entire month is full of discounts and sales. And then at the very end, you have the mad rush by the American male to hurry up and buy something at the last minute because they hadn't thought about it until now. The Retail Federation actually has done a study for the last 5 or 6 years, recognizing that of the men who shop the last 2 days before Christmas, 50% of what they purchase is bought at a convenience store. So if you have been the proud recipient of a six-pack and a Slim Jim, you now know why. So the delaying tactics of the American male shopper sends legions of angry women into the stores after Christmas to get rid of the junk that we bought them to get what they really want, and they traditionally spend 2, 3, 4 times as much as we spent on the original gift, and that saves fourth quarter. So for the last several years, we've had strong fourth quarter. So if we get through quarter three in good shape, close to 3%, and then we have a good fourth quarter, well, we're going to end the year 2.5, 2.6. I mean, that's quite respectable growth. That's 20-year average growth. The critical thing right now, and it's certainly affecting your industry because many of your customers would be in that upper third. The upper third of income earners are the ones who are spending money. They have not been affected particularly by any of the downturns so far. They've obviously been hit by inflation like everybody else, but not to the point that it keeps them from spending. It just means that they're getting less than they would have because their money lost value during the inflationary surge. But they are still doing very, very well. Much of the demand for architectural woodwork is going to come from high-end homes. And if you look at the home building patterns, and we'll show a chart here in a minute that illustrates where this is going on, the home building that's taking place is mostly higher end. The lower third, those who are living on 50,000 or less, they have checked out already. They are living paycheck to paycheck. Inflation nailed them to the wall. So they're not doing much at all. The emphasis for retailers and everybody else has been the upper third and the middle third. The middle third is continuing to spend as long as they have job security. About half of them are living paycheck to paycheck, which means that if anything happens to their job or income stream, they're in trouble. At the moment, they're pretty confident about labor. There's still a severe labor shortage. There's still a lot of demand for employees, but that can change, and it can change fast, and it will change sector to sector. Some areas of the country will feel it more than others. And not to go on a rant about labor supply, because I've done it before, but it's becoming more and more a driver of economic concern. So just to reiterate what we said in past sessions, by the end of this decade, by 2030, every single boomer will have reached retirement age. Now, realistically, they're not all going to quit at the same time, but you've got 76 million people who are going to be eligible to retire. More and more of them are retiring every day. Every single day, there are 20,000 new applicants for Social Security. Now, there's no replacement for them on the horizon. It's not something we can turn to immigration to solve. It's not something that we can turn to the family to solve. I mean, even if people started having kids at a prodigious rate, unless you plan to change the child labor laws, it's not going to be a help for half a dozen years. I mean, more like a decade and a half. So that shortage of people is playing a tremendous role in stabilizing employment. And it's one of the reasons that wages have not come down. Every other part of inflation has, but inflation on the wage side hasn't because there's still a shortage. And as long as that exists, it kind of keeps that unemployment rate fairly stable. So we're back to our old patterns. We now spend more than we make. We were avid savers during the pandemic because we didn't have a choice. We had all this money that was coming in to sort of help us deal with the recession. Great idea. That's what you do during a recession. You throw money at the consumer and hope he spends. Not if there's no place to spend it. So we saved it, and we had a tremendous blowing of money come cascading into the economy right after the restrictions were lifted. So we were making up for lost time. We were traveling more, we were buying more stuff, and now you can see the impact. We're not saving anything. And we're seeing a little bit of a decline even in the overall pattern of saving. The infusions of money that we got, the various surges of fiscal stimulus, even the quantitative easings, they had progressively less impact with every subsequent version. Household expectations coming down some from what they were during the post-pandemic period, but if you look at the numbers, way higher than they have been for decades. I mean, our expectations are still very high. But to reiterate, it's coming from that upper arm of the K. Now, what makes this even more interesting is what that group of people tends to spend their money on. The higher end income earners are not thing buyers. They have all that stuff. I mean, if you're in the upper third, you're making 100,000, you have for years, you have a car, you have electronics, you have recreational vehicles, you have all that stuff. So you're not likely to get more. Now you're spending on services. The vast majority of the money spent by the upper arm of that K is on services. They spend it on traveling. They spend it on vacations. They spend it on having people do things for them that they don't want to do. So I don't want to mow my yard anymore. I don't want to shovel snow anymore. I don't want to clean my house anymore. I don't want to do any of that stuff. So I'm going to hire people to do it for me. That's part of what drives wage hikes because you've got a demand for people to perform those services that often exceeds the number of people willing to perform those services. So you end up with driving inflation from another direction, from the wage perspective. This is the optimistic slide. This is the one that talks about how capital spending is still on the increase. It has leveled off a bit, but it is still leveling off at a level higher than it has been in years. It's way above the trend line. What's driving this is labor. If you can't find people, then you're going to have to substitute robotics, technology, automation, anything to continue production even without a workforce that you simply can't find. So you've seen it for years in manufacturing, you've seen it for years in construction, you've seen it in all kinds of sectors. It's now becoming more common on the service side. So it's everything from self-serve. I mean, how many places now have a fully staffed retail outlet? I mean, they don't. I mean, you go in and you get the stuff yourself and you bring it up to the front yourself and you check yourself out and you barely acknowledge anybody's existence that works there. You don't need them anymore. And that is becoming the norm even on the service side. So one of the assessments of reaction to rates would be that you would probably see even more investment on the capital side given the projection for labor. There just is no surge. I mean, every so often you'll hear economists talking about the mother of all recessions that's supposed to happen in 2030. That's often been the Bolio brothers, Brian and Alan. And when I've talked to them about it, it's like, yeah, he says, yeah, we are no better at predicting the future than anybody else, but we're simply warning that, look, by 2030, this comes to a head. This labor shortage thing, which has been a problem already, becomes really acute. And if there's no solution in sight, it's enough to bury the economy. And so that's kind of where this doomsday stuff comes from. The relationship that Powell is managing against, its wages, trying to figure out where the employment circumstances are. And it gets more complicated all the time. The way that the Fed looks at employment is a little different than the way you see it presented by the press. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases its data, they release 6 different cuts. The one that you see most common is U3. U3 is the easiest of the 6 because it's literally just people who are getting unemployment, who are on the unemployment list, on the rolls, and are actively looking for work. U6 picks up the discouraged worker, the person who's not getting unemployment, who's not formally in the system, but is just as unemployed. U6 is actually a more accurate number, but it's also a harder one to get your hands around. For example, people who are in the gig economy, wages are money coming from Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and all, they often will report that they are not working. We do the household survey and we ask, is there anybody working in the household? And people doing those jobs will frequently say no. What do you mean, no? You're in that car every day. You've got thousands of rides according to your apps. Not a real job. Don't have a boss. Don't have to drive. If I don't feel like driving tomorrow, I don't. If I don't feel like driving next week, I don't. It's not a real job. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. We don't know how to count them. And so we know that they're providing economic impetus. We know they're earning money, but they are classifying themselves as unemployed. We have the same problem, by the way, with drug dealers. We know they're working too. They won't report anything. And it's like, look, we can see that there's income here. We can see that you are providing economic activity in your neighborhood. All we want to know is how much. We're not police after all, but for some reason they still won't fill out the forms. But you have all of this kind of work going on that is pushing money into the economy. It's sometimes referred to collectively as the informal economy. We have a significant amount of it in the US. When you get outside the US into countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, the informal economy is almost half the actual economy. The part that we are actually able to count is less than 50%, and the rest of it is coming from this informal activity. So inflation is coming down, the rate anyway. The inflation itself is not. And that's, again, it seems to confuse the press because you'll see these stories like, well, the inflation rate has dropped to 2.3, 2.4. Why aren't prices going down? Gah, you nitwit. It's the rate that has slowed. So the good news is it's not raising any faster, but it takes a long time for the prices to reverse because you've got to have certain circumstances. The two things that will reverse inflation, the first is competitive activity. I mean, you're going to have a circumstance before long, before a company A takes a look at the market and says, you know, if I come into the market just a little bit cheaper than my competitor, competitor B, I will pick up market share. So I'm going to cut my prices just enough to start taking some away from my competitor. Well, the competitor looks at that and says, well, oh yeah, you're going to cut your prices. Well, I'm going to cut my prices even more. And then the first guy says, well, oh yeah, well, I'm going to cut my prices even lower than I had before. So if you get that cycle, you'll start to see prices come down. That will happen in a competitive market a lot faster than it will in a non-competitive market. So if you already have a near monopolistic position or oligopolistic, you may not lower your prices at all because there's no reason to do so. The other thing that will drop inflation is a good old-fashioned recession. So if the consumer really is out of money, well, then they can't spend any. And if they can't spend any, then they can't handle the inflation and the prices will start to drift down. The first place that you'll see real inflationary decline is probably going to be in kind of the non-discretionary categories that are aimed at lower income consumers. You're probably not going to see it at the high end because those people have plenty of money already and they don't mind spending it. You probably will not see it in discretionary because, again, they're taking advantage of the fact that people want it. If they have money, they'll buy it. This is the famous Fed dot plot. not to go into gory detail about the Fed, but the group that makes the decision about interest rates is the Open Market Committee. The Open Market Committee is made up of the Board of Governors plus four regional Fed presidents. They have a tremendous amount of influence because they are the eyes and ears of the Fed. Couple other things about the regional guys. They are not appointed by the president. They are not affected by Congress. If you are on the Board of Governors, you are selected by the president, submitted as a nomination. It goes in front of the Senate Banking Committee. They report out yay or nay, and then the whole Senate either approves or disapproves of the recommendation. And basically, whatever the Banking Committee says goes. Presidents have frequently nominated people to the board that don't make it through that committee. Obama had like 9 failures, Trump had 11. So the banking committee basically says if they ain't bankers and if they ain't economists, we're not approving them. Now, there are members of the board who are not involved with interest rate conversations because half of what the Fed does is regulatory. I mean, that's how Jerome Powell got into the Fed in the first place. He was the regulatory guy. They made him chairman because he was considered a good organizer. His predecessor was Janet Yellen, who was a very good economist with a banking background, but she's not notorious for her ability to manage people. And when you've got 14, 15 people of varying ego sizes, it's like herding cats. So they brought Powell in because he's good at that. When you read the Fed minutes, he barely says anything at all about the economy, interest rates, or anything else. That's not his forte. So the person that ends up with the most influence is often Doug Waller, who is the former head of research for the St. Louis Fed. Back to those regional guys. They are selected by the local board. There are 12 regions of the Fed in the U.S. Each region has its own board, and that board is who picks who their Fed representative is going to be. So, what does all this mean in the great scheme of things? If you look at who's going to be on the board or on the Open Market Committee next year, there's one very significant face. He is from the Kansas City Fed. His name is Jeff Schmidt. Now, the Kansas City Fed has a reputation for being one of the most hawkish, conservative of the 12. So going all the way back to the 2008 recession, you had Tom Honig as the representative for Kansas City. And when we were dropping rates to near zero, it was a unanimous but one vote. Everybody thought it was a good idea except Honig, who voted against it. When he retired, he was replaced by Esther George. Esther George, charming middle-aged woman until she starts talking inflation, and then she looks like she's going to have a seizure and is, again, very hawkish. Jeff Schmidt is even more hawkish than her, more hawkish than Honig. He is a disciple of Paul Volcker. So, think back to the 1980s. Some of you can do this. I can. Some of you are like, why? 80s were bad hair decade. Who wants to? But if you remember the early 80s, we had a really massive inflation issue. It was eating the economy alive. So Paul Volcker was brought in to deal with it. And it was like, hey, Uncle Paul, can you deal with inflation? He said, why, of course I can. So cigar clenched between his teeth. He raised interest rates 20 points. I mean, we're sitting around obsessing over a quarter point, half point. Oh my God, what are we going to do? It went up a quarter point, you know, gasp, gasp. Volcker jammed those rates up 20 points in one meeting. And he said, look, this is the way you kill inflation. This basically practically kills every business in the country, throws the country into recession. Everybody gets fired. If you're fired, well, you can't spend any money because you're not making any. And if you're not spending any money, nobody can raise their prices. You're welcome. It's like, but Uncle Paul, this is going to give us like recession 2 to 3. He says, yep, 2 to 3 years, maybe 5, 10, 20. I don't know. You didn't bring me into control recession. You brought me into control inflation. So just be aware that next year you're having a Volckerite on that committee. So when the conversation about raising rates, lowering rates, you're going to have that voice saying, don't be hasty, don't lower the rates too much because that sets off bad things. Long term, the estimate is somewhere in that vicinity, 4, 3.5, whatever. There's still some talk about getting down as low as 2.75. More of the forecasts that I have seen have been around 3, 3.5. Still pretty far down from where we are now, but of course nowhere near what we saw when the rates were bottomed out. But look where they have been traditionally. I mean, we act like we've never seen rates this high. Well, we saw them in 2005, 2006. We saw them even higher than we've seen lately in the turn of the century, 2000. So there's always been a kind of a tendency to push rates up a little bit higher. The anomaly was when we dropped them down to zero. Manufacturing is critical to the U.S. It's critical to most countries in the world. I won't go into a standard manufacturing rant in the interest of time, but looking at the PMI, we're slowing. Most countries in the world are. This is one of the more reliable ways of looking at the economy because the data is solid. When you ask a purchasing manager, they don't know enough to lie. So if you say, gee, are you buying more or less steel? More. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make. Somebody told me to buy more steel and we're out of toilet paper. They just buy what people tell them to buy. So if they're buying more, they're anticipating growth. If they're buying less, they're anticipating decline. And at the moment, there's a little bit of hesitancy at the manufacturing level. We're not in danger level exactly, but anything under 50 is contraction. Anything over 50 is expansion. We were in expansion barely for most of this year, but the last few months we have fallen under 50. Still pretty high 40s, not panic time, but not heading in quite the right direction. Here are some of the hot spots. None of these will come as a big surprise to you. Texas is growing like crazy, but that corridor reaches all the way up the Midwest. It includes Oklahoma, it includes Kansas and Missouri. A lot of motivation for this, everything from reshoring to transportation corridors, and it stretches in some cases all the way to the Canadian border. Lots to do with rail mergers, and we can get into that later. The other area, of course, is the Southeast. I mean, it's Florida, it's Georgia, it's Tennessee, it's parts of Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina. That whole area is on fire. But it's different depending on the circumstance of the state. For example, Florida is attracting the wealthiest migrants in the country and the oldest. So what you would see driving some of the construction activity in Texas has been schools. We do a report for electrical contractors, and they were kind of looking like where is our good place to be for education. So generally, when education is the backbone of your business, you're going to follow the demographics. They're going to build schools where there are kids. Well, a lot of activity in Texas, a lot of activity in Oklahoma, a lot of activity in the Southwest, virtually no activity in Florida. If you're moving to Florida as a retiree, you're not interested in elementary schools. That has nothing to do with you. Secondary schools either. So that part of the country is seeing a lot of expansion for wealthy buyers, which can be really useful for the woodworkers because this is going to be the market that wants nicer homes, wants more exotic design, wants architecturally sound stuff. So that whole area is probably, even though it's not ranked sometimes as high as the Texas area, it is more lucrative for some businesses. What else is growing in the Southeast, Florida, and it's medical. Gee, I wonder why. Um, we boomers are getting older and we don't like it, and we are spending a great deal of money, particularly discretionary, on medical care. I mean, the fastest growing medical procedures in the US now are knee and hip replacements because they're like instantaneous. I mean, I was just giving a talk today. That's why I'm sitting in a hotel. A guy comes up to me, we were talking about this, and he says, yeah, I don't know why I waited so long, but I went in. to get some work done on my knees because they were giving me a lot of trouble. And the guy says, well, do you want me to do both of them? Okay, I guess. How incapacitated will I be? So you'll be walking by the end of the day. What? Guy comes in, gets his operation, goes home the next morning and was up and walking the very day of the operation. So a lot of this is stimulating activity, particularly in parts where that retired population is migrating. One of the other fast-growing communities of all places is Fargo. And part of what's been driving that kind of migration is the cost of living in other states. Study was done trying to figure out how much you would have to make in every given state to live a quote comfortable life. To do that in California would cost you $190,000 a year. That's the income you'd have to make. To live that same comfortable life in Fargo, 50,000. So now you're getting people saying, I know it's pretty far from the beach, but I don't care. I'm going to save 150,000 bucks if I move to North Dakota. We have a whole different situation as far as oil and gas is concerned, much more stable, prices staying in the 80s per barrel, and this is predominantly because of how we consume. Just think about this week that we have the hurricane barreling through the Gulf. Do you remember what happened to gas prices?
Oh, I think Chris
Shoot up.
froze on
And
us.
yeah,
Oh, you're
what's
back.
that?
You froze for a second, Chris.
Yeah, I was hoping that didn't happen, but we are flying by the seat of our pants here in
Hopefully not Florida in the hurricane. All right, everybody, let me see if I can kick Chris out and get him back in. Hold on one second.
the hurricane isn't going to hit Fargo. So we have a very different environment as far as oil is concerned. A lot of conversation about what happens with taxes. And to be honest, no one really knows because the conversation in Congress has been negative when it comes to doing anything about the corporate tax rate. There's not a lot of enthusiasm to actually do this. So we're probably going to see taxes staying about where they are now, but one never knows. I mean, it's going to be political. We'll see who wins in the fall. And I get a lot of questions about what happens if one of the other candidates wins. The presidential race doesn't mean much, to be honest. The president does not have a lot of control over the economy. What really matters is who controls Congress. And as close as it's likely to be, it's really going to throw a lot of support behind the centrists, the few of them that remain, because it's like if you don't get them on board, well, you're not going to have enough votes to get anything done. And let's recognize that for the last several years, we've seen very, very little legislation coming out of Congress. It has been so paralyzed and so basically backlogged and locked into debates that it just never end. Most of the decisions that are being made now are being made at the state level, and that particularly affects construction. So this is an eye chart, but you can see what's been going up, what's been going down as far as consumer prices. We have seen, this is the watch. This comes from Armada. You guys get this, I think, in addition to the flagship, or you can. This has been proving to be remarkably accurate, 96, 97% accuracy quarter after quarter. That's because the guy that built our models is a retired lieutenant colonel who used to be in the artillery, and he really needed to be accurate there. So the point is, look where retail is, way above trend line, staying above trend line. Even if some of the negative stuff shows up, it's still above trend line. You look at non-residential construction, very important for your sector. It's almost exponential growth. It's been coming out of the pandemic like it's on fire and still growing. So you're seeing a lot of concentration in warehouse, logistics, supply chain, but medical as well. Residential continues to grow way above trend again. mostly upper end homes, but certain amount in the middle sector, not much on the starter home sector. Those people have been kind of priced out of the system. They'll have to see mortgage rates drop pretty considerably before they get back into the game. Manufacturing in general, above trend line. It's still growing, still expected to exceed what the expectations were even a year ago. And if you look at machinery, same thing. It's back up towards trend. Now, machinery is really sensitive to construction and agriculture. Those are the two sectors where you see a lot of machinery buying. It's been a good crop year so far. Their expectations are pretty high, and if that happens, there'll be a big surge in farm equipment purchasing. So the last couple of things to talk about, and I really will shut up as our time is coming to an end. What's been driving inflation besides wages has been transportation. You can see down there at the bottom, that blue line is the most aggressive of the growth lines in CPI. The global supply chain pressure index is now rising again. It's not anywhere near where it was during the pandemic, obviously, but it's trending back up again. And this is why. The Red Sea mess is enough to completely shut down that route for container ships or any other kind of ship. They can't get insurance. And this was made abundantly clear a month or so ago when a tanker was under attack by the Houthi. It was being escorted by a British and American destroyer, and they still got through. These two destroyers knocked 98% of the missiles and drones out of the sky, but 2% got through and damaged the tanker enough to punch a hole in it. And so the insurance companies are like, that does it. We're not touching anything that goes through that region. So now you have an inflation rate of 268% on average. Even Shanghai to LA up 232%. It's just a shortage of ships. There are not enough container ships because the ones that are out there are having to stay on the water far longer. Going around the coast of Africa adds 2 or 3 days to a voyage. So, to make this even worse, as if it needs to be, in about 3 days, the ports on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast are likely to be on strike. When that contract expired in August, they had the month of September to do a new contract. The talks broke off. There is no chance, really, of an agreement being reached in the next 2 or 3 days, which means there'll be a strike. And the last time the ILWU, International Longshore Warehouse Union, went on strike, it was against West Coast ports, and that lasted almost 2 months. So if that happens, you basically shut down shipping for the entire Eastern and Gulf Coast seaboards. So if you don't think that's going to have an impact on supply and materials and inventory, wow. I mean, that's the reason that the retailers ordered early. That's why they tried to get their orders in before this breakpoint because they knew it was coming. So we'll see. Hopefully it's a short-lived strike, but most of the indications are not pointing in that direction. So with that, you already get the flagship, so you know something about it. It is 3 days a week, and the watch comes out every month, and the executive suite thing comes out once a week. All of this, by the way, for the price of a cup of coffee. But anyway, I think I have like a minute and a half for questions. So I'll let Toby field any of those that might have come in.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We do have one in the Q&A and then one person with their hand raised. So for the Q&A first, someone asked, is there going to be a dock strike?
Well, that's kind of what I was talking about. I think there definitely will be. There's the only hope we have now is that it's short-lived, that it's kind of a demonstration that yes, we are going to do this, and the shippers will then have the ball in their court, and then they're going to have to decide. The fear on the part of people watching the system is that you'll have a big price increase because the shippers will give in to the union demands. They don't really have a choice. And that suddenly throws a lot more inflation on the shipping side.
Okay. We had a hand up earlier. If that person still wants to speak, you can put your hand back up, or if anybody else has a question, now is the time. Okay. All right. I guess there's no other questions.
All right. Well,
Um,
remember, you can always send me an email. I can answer questions. I'm just as long-winded in print as I am in public. So feel free to send those by email and I'll be glad to answer them. Unless they're really a hard question, in which case I'll make my partner answer it.
all right, Chris, sounds good. Thank you so much for joining us again. I really appreciate it. And we will see you soon.
All right. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later.
Thank you, everybody.